Today we're going to explore one of the greatest railroad stories of all time. There never before had been an undertaking like this. With all the hardships the builders faced, it's amazing that the thing ever got built. We're going to be clearing up misconceptions about the First Transcontinental Railroad. For instance, when I was a young guy in school, in grade school, we were taught that it was the Transcontinental Railroad in the singular. But we have our first fascinating factoid, and that is the route consisted of two different railroads, each under distinct ownership. From the east came the Union Pacific Railroad from Omaha, Nebraska. Then building from the west was the Central Pacific Railroad, building from Sacramento, California. By themselves, these two railroads did not cross the entire continent, but they hooked up with existing railroads in the eastern United States to facilitate for the first time travel all the way from the Atlantic coast out to the west coast. Another amazing factoid is that the distance covered by these two railroads is about the same distance as our namesake railroad, after which this channel is named, the Northern Pacific, which would be completed 14 years later. Both these railroads, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, started construction 163 years ago in the year 1863. They built toward each other, not knowing exactly where they would meet. It took 6 years to finish the construction, but they finally met in a little spot up north of the Great Salt Lake in Utah at Promontory Summit. The Union Pacific started west from Council Bluffs, Iowa, in the middle of the United States. And Council Bluffs is right on the Missouri River, and somehow they had to get their trains across the Missouri, and they didn't yet have a bridge, so they ended up taking those big locomotives and the train cars and all the rails and spikes and other equipment that it would take to build the railroad. They took all that across the Missouri River by boat. Can you imagine a boat back in those days carrying something as heavy as a locomotive and rail cars? As they went west, the builders of the Union Pacific crossed America's Great Plains, which are flat and doesn't have the number of obstacles that were being encountered by the Central Pacific Railroad, which was building east from California. One of the biggest obstacles encountered by the Union Pacific builders was the Dale Creek Gorge out in Wyoming, and they had to build a wood bridge across this gorge. It was an enormous wood bridge. It would be 720 feet in length and 150 feet high. This bridge turned out to be so rickety that even the railroad crew members were afraid to cross it. It's been written that the locomotive engineers would sometimes stop their trains before they crossed the bridge. The engineers would get off, have their firemen, who would remain in the locomotives, drive the trains across the bridge at a very slow 4 miles per hour. And once the trains had cleared the bridge, the engineers would then walk across the bridge. The winds got so high in this area that railroad management was afraid that the winds might even blow a train off the bridge. In 1876, 7 years after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific replaced the wood bridge with an iron bridge that, at least to look at it, was even weaker still. Union Pacific didn't make a big deal out of this bridge, at least publicly, because they didn't want to discourage passengers from going west on their trains. Personally, had I known that this bridge was there, I probably would have avoided the whole Union Pacific line just because of it. The iron bridge didn't last long either, as Union Pacific decided to just reroute the line in that area, and they disassembled the bridge. Today, all that's remaining are the stone piers that held up the bridge, and those are on private property, so we can no longer go in and see those without getting permission from the property owner. The biggest stories of hardship and danger actually belong to the Central Pacific Railroad, which had started in Sacramento and was heading east to its meeting with the Union Pacific in Utah. The Central Pacific needed lots of steel and iron, rails and spikes and tools and other types of equipment to build its railroad. And for those items, they relied on companies such as the Cambria Iron Company in Pennsylvania and the Phoenix Iron Works Company, also located in Pennsylvania. For locomotives, it relied on the Schenectady Locomotive Company, which was headquartered in New York. This is the Jupiter, one of the locomotives the Central Pacific used in building its rails east. Its weight, very heavy, 65,400 pounds, or about 32.7 tons, and that equates to the weight of over 20 Toyota Camrys. The Central Pacific faced an enormous problem in getting all those heavy items from the eastern United States around the Pennsylvania and New York area out to Sacramento, where it would start building its part of the railroad. Remember that this was still in the era of the wagon train, and of course wagons couldn't haul those heavy items all the way out from the east. So what could Central Pacific do to get those items? There were no roads, no trucks in those days. Cars really hadn't been invented yet. They ended up using sailing ships, and those boats had to be loaded in the New York area or along the Atlantic coast, and then go all the way down to the bottom of South America, around Cape Horn there, and then back up. And that was about a 13,000-mile trip, which is about 5 times the distance between New York and the closest European ports. It took a sailing ship about 4 to 5 months to make that trip. Not only was it very time-consuming, it was also extremely expensive. The ships would dock at San Francisco and unload their cargo there, but it was still a long ways to get everything up to Sacramento. The cargo was loaded onto yet another set of boats that would thread their way through the San Francisco Bay and finally into the Sacramento River and go upstream on the Sacramento and unload their contents there. Finally, heavy items like locomotives had to be shipped in pieces so that they would be small and light enough that human beings could load and unload them. Once those items reached Sacramento, they had to be assembled by very skilled tradesmen. Because of the great historical importance of this, as well as the amazing story it all is, parts of Sacramento have been restored, as well as the railroad facilities there, and now we can go and get a feeling of what it was like back then. This is the hardware store of Huntington and Hopkins, who would go on to be 2 of the 4 founding fathers of the Central Pacific Railroad. This is a well-known steamboat that operated on the Sacramento River, running between San Francisco and Sacramento, beginning in 1860, and hauled a great deal of material and workers for building the railroad from the San Francisco wharfs. Look at the size of that huge paddle, and there's one on the other side as well. This boat could make the 120-mile trip in just a little over 5 hours. It operated from the wharfs of San Francisco up to Sacramento during the years of 1860 up to 1875, which was the entire time of the building of the Central Pacific. In 1875, it was sold to a company who cut the boat in half to add another 37 feet in length. And from that point, it would go on to make the run between San Francisco and Oakland up until 1940, when it burned down. Upon leaving east from Sacramento, the Central Pacific encountered 3 very big construction challenges, and all of these were within 100 miles of Sacramento. And the very first one was called Bloomer Cut. A cut had to be made through a hill of solid granite, using only picks and shovels and wheelbarrows and black powder. This cut is 800 feet long and about 63 feet high at its highest point, and you can see that they didn't take out any material that they didn't have to. It's very narrow, just barely fitting the trains. Bloomer Cut is located at the south side of the town of Auburn, California, and is easily reached by a short hike. As I was getting these drone shots, I was fortunate enough to have an eastbound Union Pacific freight train come along, working its way uphill. And I know we have a lot of train watchers on this channel, so let's take a look at it. Bloomer Cut being about 35 miles from Sacramento. This was really the first leg of the Central Pacific's construction. And up to this point, they had been using a lot of Irish workers. When they got to Bloomer Hill, the Irish workers were no longer as effective and fast working as they had been previously, and Central Pacific management was very concerned. Charles Crocker, who was one of the owners of the Central Pacific as well as the construction manager, knew he had to do something different. There were many Chinese who had come over to join the gold rush, and now that the gold rush was over, they were looking for work, so Crocker decided to use them. A lot of people thought that the Chinese couldn't get the job done because they were much smaller than the big Irishmen and Germans who had been working on the railroad. The European workers greatly resented the Chinese being the dominant part of this workforce, and there was a great deal of very angry sentiment against the Chinese. The fact that the Chinese laborers were much smaller and dressed much differently, ate odd food, and wore funny clothing only made the Europeans resent them more. Today, the Chinese are greatly revered for their part in building a railroad, as evidenced by this very large statue of a Chinese laborer that's located at the Auburn train station. About 20 miles up the mountain from Bloomer's Cut is the little town of Colfax, California, which is a stop for Amtrak's California Zephyr train, which runs from the San Francisco Bay Area out to Chicago, and that's about a 52-hour trip and very scenic. Just a few miles up the mountain from Colfax, California, going east, is the second of the three big construction challenges that the Central Pacific faced, and that's Cape Horn. Here, the track curves around the face of a very steep mountain. Once again, the workers attacked this job with nothing but pickaxes and shovels and wheelbarrows and black powder. This is steep and very rugged terrain, with the railroad tracks some 1,400 feet above the river below. If a worker tumbled down the hill, it's very unlikely that the crew would stop work and go down and collect the body. They would probably just keep on working, and that body would remain there. The Cape Horn construction project was finished in the year 1865. From Cape Horn, the construction crew worked their way up the mountain to the third of the three big construction challenges, and that's the 15 tunnels that had to be constructed. And this job was by far the most remarkable and the most chronicled of all the jobs of building the Transcontinental Railroad. The 15 tunnels are located in the state of California, although they are very close to the Nevada border. The tunnels are numbered sequentially, with the first tunnel being tunnel number 1. The builders went uphill until they built tunnel number 6, which is at the very top of the pass. That's the Summit Tunnel, and tunnels number 7 through 15 heading east are all on the downgrade. My own rough estimate is that the 15 tunnels are located along a stretch of about 30 miles in length. The total linear distance of the 15 tunnels is 6,239 feet, which gives us an average tunnel length of 416 lineal feet. In addition to the tunnels, there's about 40 miles of snow sheds that the Central Pacific had to build in order to keep the tracks clear of snow. Originally built of wood, the snow sheds would eventually be replaced with concrete. That's me on the top of the snow shed for tunnel number 7, and in the background you can see the mouth of the Summit Tunnel number 6, the big tunnel at 1,659 feet in length. Turning the drone around 180 degrees, we see tunnel number 8, which was 375 feet long, and off to the left of that was Donner Pass. One of the well-known landmarks up here is the Chinese Wall, which was built using the rubble that the workers carried out from the construction of tunnel number 6. At any one time, there was up to 8,000 men working on the construction of the tunnels. There was no mechanized machinery used on this construction project. The men used black powder and then later on nitroglycerin to blow holes in the rock. And after the smoke cleared and dust cleared, they would take wheelbarrows and shovels and picks and take the rock out and then start all over again. And they would only make about 1 to 2 feet of progress for every explosion. One of the ingenious construction methods used in building tunnel number 6 was that they went to the top of the mountain between the two tunnel faces and directly over where the tunnel was going to be going, and they dug a shaft down over 70 feet, and the shaft was 8 feet wide by 12 feet wide, and they dropped down the shaft and started tunneling toward the other crews that were tunneling, the crew that was coming in from the west and the other crew that was coming in from the east. So they're actually tunneling on 4 faces. There was no way to get the rubble out of the middle of the shaft except to lift it the 70-some feet up to the top surface. I find the method for lifting the rock out of the shaft to be one of the most fascinating factoids of the entire Transcontinental Railroad job. They got the rubble out of the shaft by using an old steam engine, which they located at the top of the mountain and employed that in lifting large buckets up and down the shaft. And there were no tracks to get the steam engine up there, so they had to get this, and it must have weighed at least 20 tons. So they used any animals they had, and they used manpower and were able to push it very slowly. It took a long time to get that steam engine up there, but they did. Here's the photo. The large barn-style building is what's covering the steam engine and the shaft, and the rails that come out of the building were used by cars I can only imagine. They look like ore cars that would take the rubble and disperse it. Once the tunnels were finished, it was relatively easy for the Central Pacific to go down the hill and where they would cross the state of Nevada and then go on into Utah, where they would meet with the Union Pacific and complete the Transcontinental Railroad. The completion of the railroad resulted in a huge celebration, not just at Promontory, but around the country as well. They had put in a telegraph line while they were building the railroad and were able to tap back to New York live that the last rail is laid, the last spike is driven, the Pacific Railroad is completed. On May 10th, in 1969, the 100th anniversary of the driving of the Golden Spike, there was a big celebration, but still the Chinese weren't recognized. And I was fortunate to be at the 150th anniversary, May 10th, 2019, at the site of the driving of the Golden Spike. And finally they recognized the Chinese laborers who put so much into building this railroad. There were over 300 of them killed during the construction of the Transcontinental. In researching early newspapers for this story, I found a very interesting commentary published in the New York City's newspaper called The Independent, and the date of the article is October 30th, 1870, which was just 17 months after the Transcontinental's completion. And commentaries like this I find very valuable. It's interesting to find out facts about the building of the railroad, but it's more difficult to find out what people's attitudes were of the railroad this 150 plus years after. So I will read just a portion of this article to you. Among the marvels of success and industrial enterprises of modern times must be ranked the Pacific Central Railroad. 50 years ago, such a scheme was regarded as absurd. 25 years ago, it was regarded as the work of a century. 10 years ago, it was looked upon as the project of overly sanguine enthusiasts. It was vitally necessary to our California colonists, and they worked hard for it. Never was any peaceful undertaking of the same magnitude carried out with the same energy and rapidity. After it was completed, there were some who doubted if it could successfully be worked. Others anticipated hostility from Indians, but all these shadows have been banished by 2 seasons of successful working of this railroad. 100 years before the Transcontinental Railroad's completion in 1869, the western United States, with probably the exception of California, the California missionaries, was inhabited entirely by indigenous people, the American Indians, whose greatest invention over the course of a lifetime might be the creation of a new knot or a new way to use a piece of wood. Now let's jump forward to the year 1969, 100 years after the Transcontinental Railroad's completion. Technology had gone wild in that 100 years, and it was that year that we first landed a man on the moon, and a Japanese bullet train would haul people at a rate of speed of 180 miles per hour. But forget the passenger trains. We could just jump on a jet airplane and we could easily cross the American continent in a mere 6 hours, which was basically, you could do it between meals. Electric lights and telephones and television, medical surgeries and automobiles had already been around for so long that they were taken for granted. The invention of railroads is certainly one of the most important factors in these rapid advancements, perhaps the most important factor. In closing, I am dedicating this film to the railroad workers who built the early railroads, and especially to the thousands of Chinese men. None of their correspondence or diaries are known to exist in the United States or China. We have no records of them as individuals. We don't know their names. And finally, huge thanks to President Abraham Lincoln, who at the time was that he chartered the railroads. He was also fighting the Civil War, which must have taken a huge amount of his attention. But he spearheaded the construction of our transcontinental railroad system by signing the Pacific Railroad Acts, which chartered both the first transcontinental railroad and the second transcontinental railroad, that of the Northern Pacific, which was completed finally in 1883. In our next episode, we cover the construction of a transcontinental railroad branch, whose arrival in the year 1876 quickly grew a small town into one of the world's great cities that we know today as Los Angeles. And that's a fantastic story. Imagine growing Los Angeles from 5,000 people into millions of people in very short order. So please join us for that, and please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. Hope to see you next time.